Alrighty, let's get going. Let's clear out some questions. Okay, I think I talked about that last time. Oh, right. Uh, no, that's the wrong button. These are back labeled. I don't like this. Okay, that's already off. Dim that. All right, sorry about the slight delay. One of the problems with Tori and wearing a dress shirt in Tori in the first 2 weeks of the semester is you get stopped and asked for directions a lot. On my way here, I swear, 3 people asked me where Tori lecture was, or where is this room number? And it's just like, okay, I hate this place. This is the best building for getting lost in because of the way they decided to label it. Okay, I answered that last time. Oops. Hopefully, I opened 10 new spots in the class, so hopefully everybody who wanted to get in got in. What? Okay, yes, I answered that too. It answered that. I don't know if I answered that. We'll come back to it. I think I did actually. Okay. Alrighty. So today we're going to keep talking about kind of this history of youth and childhood. So I think if I recall, oh yeah, sorry, I'm a little ahead of where I was. We got to about here, right? So we'll pick up from here, talk about some of the kind of thinkers that Postman thinks are particularly key when talking about childhood. Talk a little bit about kind of what things looked like in the industrial period and give you a little bit of a history, very briefly, of kind of the beginnings of the social welfare system aimed at children. And then, if we have time, we'll switch presentations altogether and we will move into talking about kind of our first of our or we'll talk about the generations unit, right? So we're going to start talking about different generational cohorts and the sort of experience they had as young people. But we'll see where we get today. Okay, so last time, basically we left off talking a little bit. I'll go back one slide here about what kind of Postman's idea, right? And we're getting here to the end of the incunabula of childhood. But this notion that is way too loud. There we go. Now you can't hear me at all. All right. I don't know. We'll see. I'll just talk loud. Adults controlling the symbolic environment of the young, right, specifically through print and literacy, becomes the key to how this whole system basically works, right? How we get childhood today, right? And because this transition from childhood to adulthood is one that becomes more and more controlled, right? And largely down to what information are young people getting. Now, Postman thinks this is largely a result of the medium, right? So of actual print. That print itself sort of pushes society to adopting certain standards and certain ways of doing things, right? And like I said last time, this is largely a function of his sort of philosophy of how technology works. Following from other people like the Canadian scholars Harold Innes and Marshall McLuhan, he thinks that technology sort of puts its stamp on the people that use it, right? So that you are shaped ultimately by the technologies that are circulating when you are, particularly, well, he thinks at a society level, when we go forward and we start talking about our generational cohorts, one of the things that Jean Twenge suggests is that this is largely because of, you're largely shaped by the technologies that are dominant when you're young, right? Particularly when you're in your teens and early 20s. Okay, and this kind of lasts, I think we ended off on this point on Friday. Learning, and especially teaching people how to read and write, literacy, becomes an important intellectual and moral pursuit in society, right? It becomes paramount. And we'll see that when we talk about John Locke in particular. And Locke is an influential philosopher of the English Enlightenment. And his kind of notion is that, it's a moral failing of adults if children aren't properly educated. And this kind of view becomes largely dominant. Okay, I did mention some of these things last time, so I won't belabor it too much. But through this, 500-year period, or I guess we're talking about 400 years here. Let's say from about 1440 to about 1850, right? What you have is increasingly more and more control over the information environment, through schools, through literacy, and through all of that stuff, right? And this has larger societal effects. And I talked about this a little bit last time, right? You get really strong splits between things like public and private knowledge, right? And you get a really strong formation of a public and private sphere, where the idea is, like what goes on in your home, that is in the private sphere. What goes on out in the world, like in the marketplace or where you work, that's largely in the public sphere, right? But public knowledge, really in the way that Postman is using it, means things that can be discussed anytime, any place, versus private knowledge, things that need to be kept secret from some, right? Now, there comes to be quite, detailed sort of taxonomies of what knowledge is for whom. And obviously, as we're moving into like the Victorian period, Edwardian and Victorian England in particular, lots of people get excluded from this. But things like sex, war, politics, economics, right, are largely the purview of the private sphere, and especially things like war, economics, social policy, government are largely, the purview of men, right, out in the public sphere, earning a living, being out, doing commerce, discussing politics. This is left to men to do. And again, if you've ever seen, any show set in like Edwardian or Victorian England, right, your Pride and Prejudice, I guess Downton Abbey's a little bit later, but kind of same idea, right? There are these very distinct spheres that men and women occupy. Men are supposed to go, have a whiskey and a cigar after dinner, and that's where they're going to talk about, the news of the day, finances, war, politics, all of that stuff. Obviously, sex is mostly meant for the bedroom, and then women are largely excluded from a lot of these discussions, right? Simply the culture of the time. And yeah, private knowledge is kept a secret, and people are only told things when they need to be, right? So only when you're deemed enough of an adult are those secrets revealed to you, right? At some point, the boy gets invited into the smoking room with the adults, right? And so on and so forth. So shame returns for Postman as an important category, and it's largely governed by this slow dribbling out of information, because suddenly you have physical space that actually makes it possible to have private space, right? You have separate rooms in houses, you have nurseries for children, smoking rooms for the men. All of these things separate out knowledge, separate out things. So suddenly it's not flowing everywhere. But again, this is largely, at least at first, something that is for the wealthy, right? And even, I guess, to this day, we still have this notion, because it gets coined kind of towards the end of this period, right, in the 19th century, that a lot of the ways that this is structured, right, a lot of the beliefs around things like sex and economics are bourgeois, right, which is basically a kind of Marxist word for, it's a word in French as well, for this kind of wealthy merchant class. So a lot of these, if we have particularly sort of conservative views of, say, sex or economics, a lot of times these would be labeled kind of bourgeois by Marxist scholars, because they're associated with this kind of middle and upper class wealthy people. Okay, so I'm going to open up seats for other classes you teach too. So I opened up more in SOC of religion. They filled up in like 7 minutes, I think. They filled up really quickly. So I don't think I'm opening up any more than that. I just want to scroll forward because I thought I had these in a different order. Okay, I see what's happening. All right. So I have these in slightly reverse order from where they are in my head. All right. So with the coming of industrialization, right? So kind of towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, we really start to get industrialization, right? Now, this continues a split that had already been existing in pre-industrial Europe, where the children of the middle and upper classes would have childhoods not exactly the same as what we think today, certainly shorter, but a childhood nonetheless, right? And the children of the working class, the peasants, peasants largely, would not, right? They would be put to work in the same way as their medieval kind of counterparts would have, right? So we get a really, really strong split during the industrial period between sort of the childhood haves and the childhood have-nots, right? And you could put childhood here as a kind of luxury belief or a luxury institution in this period, right? Those who have the luxury and the wealth to support children, right, who aren't living sort of hand to mouth, aren't having trouble feeding themselves, they can afford childhood and their children do have a childhood. For the rest of them, right, their children are working in factories or, if you've ever read any Dickens, right, you recognize this, they're chimney sweeps, or they're, stealing and finding ways to sort of amuse themselves and help support themselves through a variety of enterprises, right? But they're not sitting around in school at the beginning of this period. All right, more on that in a second, because this largely comes to an end towards the end of the 19th century, and I'll tell you why in a sec. Okay, so first, some of the ideas that start to circulate about young people sort of through this period, right? Really from around the middle of the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, all the way through into the 20th century. Postman kind of cues in on four sort of important ideas that really affect how people view childhood. So the first one comes from John Locke, right? And like I said, Locke is one of the philosophers that's part of what you might call the English or Scottish Enlightenments, right? As separated from, the French Enlightenment, which led more to people getting their heads cut off. The English and Scottish one didn't quite lead to, as many decapitations for whatever reason. Who knows why? The French, what can you say? All right, so the big idea that comes out of Locke is the idea of the child as a tabula rasa, right? So this is a Latin phrase which basically means blank slate. And the idea that Locke has here is that children do not come sort of pre-programmed. If Locke was having a kind of contemporary debate on this, between nature and nurture, Locke largely comes down on the nurture side of the equation, suggesting, right, there are no bad kids. No kid is born inherently immoral or bad. It is largely down to the adults in their lives and how this young person is trained that this happens, right? So there's no bad kids, only bad parents and bad teachers, right? So you're largely structured by your environment. It's a good sociological take. Okay, so because the mind is blank, right, eventually someone will get there to write things on that blank slate. And if they are good things, you get a child that is good. If they are bad things, you get a child that is, bad or malformed or immoral or whatever it has to be, right? So the job of adults is to write good things on the blank slate of the child, right? Now, this is largely done through education, right? Through teaching them literacy, huge part, right? Teaching them, proper grammar, proper thinking, good philosophy. All of these things Locke would think are essential to forming a well-formed child. Now, he is, also of the opinion that they need to be trained vigorously physically and mentally. So if you struggled through gym class, you can thank John Locke, right? At least in part, some of his ideas, basically play a role in that. And things like shame and credit are essential to Locke, right? So grades kind of evolved from this idea, right? You getting an A in this class or a C, right? If you get an A in this class, you will feel proud. If you get a C, I don't know, maybe you still feel proud. I don't know what your standards are. C's get degrees, or more properly, C is for cookie, and that's good enough for me. Right? So whatever your standards are, right? You get sort of, the idea is reward students with some kind of, credit if they do well, and shame if they do poorly. Punishment might be meted out as well, because Locke was not necessarily opposed to corporal punishment. Okay, so this idea that kids are a blank slate, right, that adults then control kind of what gets put on there, is really essential. Now, obviously, this has good and bad implications as well. And certainly when we get to the history of kind of colonialism and European relationships with, say, indigenous people, this idea has, and even though it might not be acknowledged, this idea has some definite negatives as well, right? Because say you have an indigenous person or an indigenous child, and you want to turn that child into a nice citizen of the new countries that you're founding, say in the United States or in Canada, one of the ways that you could do this would be to, be the ones that write things on that blank slate, and those would be proper English things rather than, say, indigenous things, right? So you can see where this plays out in institutions like residential schools or even day schools on reserves, right? Where, okay, you're going to put them into a Europeanized education system that focuses on, European traditions, intellectual traditions, and things like Christianity as well, right? To write certain things on that blank slate. Okay, so it's not all good. Oh, Jean-Jacques, one day I will take you out of this course. Rousseau. So, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay. Sorry, I always have a fun time with Rousseau because Rousseau is an interesting one. Rousseau comes out of a particular period in European philosophical history called the Romantic period. And the Romantics, has nothing to do with romance, like, romantic love. They have this sort of worship of nature, right? The Romantic poets and the Romantic philosophers are particularly, I guess it's a reaction to industrialization and a reaction to all of the changes that are happening in society as a result of the growth of the industrial state. And Rousseau is definitely among these philosophers. His most famous work on education is this one, Émile ou de l'éducation, or Émile or on education. And Rousseau is a kind of weird person, right? So I guess a little bit of background. He writes this book, and it's all about how we should raise children. He has some very particular ideas. What's really weird about Rousseau is he doesn't seem to have particularly actually liked children, certainly not his own. He fathers children with a number of women, abandons them all, seems to have absolutely no interest in raising any of them, right? So he scatters children around France liberally. I don't remember exactly how many, but he has, several illegitimate children, and doesn't seem particularly interested in the education of his own children, but he writes this sort of philosophical treatise on the education of children. Okay, core to this, he asserts, right, that children are good in and of themselves, right? They're not the means to an end. And you can see how this is a little bit opposed to someone like Locke, right? Where for Locke, the child, is just the means to an eventual functional adult, right? That's what you want out of a child, is to form them into an adult eventually, and a really good functional adult, right? Now, for Rousseau, this is not the case, right? The child is not a means to an end, right? They are the end in and of themselves, right? Their children are just a good, right? Not something that you have to condition in any way. Children are just good. Now, what he really likes about children, and keep in mind his sort of romantic notions here. He thinks children are as close as human beings come to the state of nature, right? So that, before we had all of this, crust of institutions, religion, industrialization, the state, the school system, right? We lived in a state of nature and kind of harmony with nature. And the children are the closest you get to this, right? They're the most in touch with their physical and emotional needs in lots of ways, right? And what we do as we raise them is we largely tamp down those things, right? We sublimate, though this is more of a Freudian word, more on him in a sec. We sublimate a lot of those desires, needs, and urges, right, to make them into kind of civilized people. And civilization for Rousseau is kind of bad, right, because it takes us away from nature. And specifically, we tamp down, some of the things about young people, the energy of youth, its dynamism, and its strength and joy. And he thinks we should, emphasize those things. Now, here's the kicker. Hang on, I'm going to erase my child-adult thing. So, for Rousseau, when you were a child, you're like a flower. I'm really, really good at drawing flowers, especially with this pen. That's a flower, not a tree with a hole in it. I'll draw a leaf. There we go. Okay, my beautiful flower, right? Flowers, again, kind of an unalloyed good for Rousseau. And what he says is that the child is like a flower. And what we need to do is, lovingly cultivate it. And any education that we give the child is meant to be like fertilizer. So it's to make grow those qualities that are already there, right? Now, again, compare this to like the tabula rasa, right? It's like in the tabula rasa, I'm going to take you and I'm going to mold you into whatever I want you to be, right? Whatever I think this fundamental, shape that society needs you to take. Well, that's what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to teach you math. I'm going to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. I'm going to teach you civics so you become a good citizen. And we're going to shape you into a functional adult at the end of the day. And Rousseau is like, mais non. I don't know why I did that. I could do it all in a terrible French accent if you like, but I won't. Mais non, we must shape them into the best version of themselves, right? You need to bring out the qualities of the child, right? Whatever that child is good at, whatever their interests and inclinations are, you fertilize that. And so, they go from being a little flower to a great big flower with those same qualities. Now, if you think old ideas from French philosophers have no impact, I guarantee you they do. Because every modern parenting philosophy that's out there, in some ways, without even acknowledging it or probably understanding where it comes from, in some ways goes back to Rousseau, right? Because one of the things that you're going to do, you probably had this done to you as a child, at least if you were raised in like a middle class or upper class household, and probably even if you're kind of working class, is your parents are going to put you into music and gymnastics, right? Gym, I can spell. And maybe a sport, right? So maybe you tried hockey. And down the list, right? Until they found something that you were really, really passionate about, right? Probably, if you had your own choice, you chose the most expensive hobby or the most expensive interest in the entire world. If you're like my daughter, you chose horseback riding. Why? I think she wants me to be poor. Right? I think that's her entire goal in life. She's turning 16 today. It's her birthday. So after class, I need to go buy a cake because I didn't have time to make one. But we also had cake last night, so it's going to be 2 days of cake for her. Anyway, she chose horseback riding, right? But we tried probably 30 different things, right? From, gymnastics to karate, to figure skating, She tried guitar for a while. I have a very small child-sized guitar. If anyone needs one, it's for sale. My other children don't want to play it because you're trying to find that thing that they're good at so that then you can like pile on the fertilizer, in this case, possibly literal fertilizer because there's horses involved. And and grow that child into the best version of themselves. And don't worry, I've done the same thing with my other two children. My daughter has not monopolized all of our time and resources. Okay, so that's Rousseau, right? And I guarantee if your parents put you in 17 different activities, right, until you found the one that you're passionate about, that's largely, a function of a Rousseauian kind of ethic in child rearing. I did a question slide for a while. Oh, I'm sure Locke did. I can't remember, but discipline, especially for someone in like the 18th, 19th century, that's just the way it was done, right? It would strengthen them, I'm sure, and teach them boundaries. Okay, we're going to talk about Freud. Must take Sigmund out. I promise, it'll be brief. I think Sigmund Freud is dumb for the most part. But, despite being a complete moron who makes shit up, he made this up for sure. Just wait, if you're in my SOC religion class, just wait till I talk about Freud and religion. It's basically like, Freud thought religion came from this. Why? No one knows. He basically just makes up the origin of religion. It involves like, the chieftain has all the women, and then he has sons, and the sons want women who are also their mothers. Weird. And so they kill their father, and then they feel bad, so they create religion. It's a really stupid idea. But then that's my opinion on Freud. I'm not a big Freudian. Okay, so very quickly, right? What does Freud contribute to this conversation about children? Well, and I think notably a lot of this comes out kind of in a very Rousseauian way out of a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. Civilization bad because it makes us move away from our drives, right? Okay, so he says that children, kind of like animals, have a bunch of qualities, right? They have an inherent sexuality, right? They have inherent instincts and drives, largely driven by, can't remember if it's the ego. I want to say it is. Or the id. Maybe it's the id. That's another made-up category, so who cares? Id, ego, superego, I probably will spend the rest of my life every time someone says, yeah, the subconscious, I'm like, the subconscious isn't real. Unconscious, we have unconscious things we do. A subconscious, like another mind inside your head that's also thinking thoughts that you're not aware of, doesn't exist. There's no science behind it. It's a Freudian idea, and it's dumb. And every time someone mentions it, I'm like, the subconscious isn't real. And then my wife elbows me, and it's like, shut up. That's kind of how it goes. She's like, no one cares about your opinions. I'm like, I care. And usually I'm in front of a room of people who have to care because they're paying to be here and I'm in charge. Okay, so anyway, not a big fan of Freud, and the subconscious I'm not a big fan of. But right, he says that children have all of these things: instincts, psychic drives, sexuality. And what is the job of getting them to adulthood? Well, we have to kind of bash those down, right? We have to sublimate them. And now for Freud, this is largely kind of a good and bad thing because, ultimately, the sublimation makes you civilized, but it also leads to you having a bunch of complexes, right? Where, you want to kill your father. No, kill your father and marry your mother. That's the Oedipus complex. Or kill your mother and marry your father. That's the Electra complex, right? All this Greek mythology stuff, it's messing me up. And a bunch of other things, right? Down to how you were potty trained. All of these things broke you and made you, the strange and beautiful being you are. And we have to then unpack it through psychoanalysis, through people like Freud who can tell you how your parents broke you. And what to do about it, right? So, big idea from Freud, though, is that this sublimation does damage, right? And that damage then has to be unpacked through life. All right, and now the one who I think is probably the least objectionable, though I'm sure there are some people who object to Dewey. Dewey kind of comes around more 20th century, and still, if you go into education, right, a lot of Dewey's thoughts are kind of at the foundation of primary education systems. One of the things that Dewey suggests, right? So children's needs have to be addressed in the present. We can't always be thinking about children's future, right? So again, I think opposition, particularly to someone like Locke and this kind of like tabula rasa philosophy, one of the things that Dewey says is, right, children, yes, that outcome of becoming an adult is really important, right? We want to make kids into functional adults, but you can't forget that while you're doing that, they're also still a child, right? So you can't always be focused on their needs or on the future outcome, right? And trust me, there's a temptation when your son spends the entire weekend playing video games because somehow he figured out your PIN on the parental controls. Who knew? I need to become more creative, but I have a limited capacity for remembering numbers. So, there's a temptation to be like, he'll never turn into anything. He's going to play video games and end up living in our basement. And there's a depression spiral that starts. But sometimes it's like you can't actually address that because you can't just be thinking about the adult. You have to be thinking about what are the actual needs of the child here and now, right? Like helping them regulate their emotions when they're having a meltdown, instead of being like, well, if I reward this behavior, they'll have meltdowns until they're 42. Or whatever it is people think. I think I've had those thoughts. So you have to address children's needs in the here and now, right? And a lot of modern educational philosophy, has moved away from really worrying about adult outcomes and more about just what children need in this moment at their developmental stage and building on that. Okay, how am I doing here? Okay, so very quickly. Postman kind of gives us a good story from about 1440 to 1800. But the story kind of and we're going to jump forward in a second to about 1940, 1945, roughly, when we start talking about the silence. I guess a little bit, maybe the 1930s, because some of the silents are born in the 30s. We're going to jump forward a little bit in a couple of seconds, maybe this class, maybe next class. But there are some really consequential things that happened specifically at the middle to end of the 19th century, because we're kind of at the tail end now of this historical development of childhood. So among things, right, because of the Industrial Revolution, England gets really, really rich, right? It gets really, really rich really, really fast. So all of the things that happen, when we talk about the development of childhood, the development of public and private spaces, right? All of these things that I talked about, if I flashed back to that one with the cottages on it, I won't do it because it's visually distressing. Most of the things that start to happen, and a lot of these developments in childhood, they start in England, right? And very specifically, not because the English are particularly special in any way. It's because England industrializes first, and so England gets rich first, right? It's all about the almighty dollar, or I suppose in this case, the almighty pound, but I can't draw the little swirly L, so I'm going to go with the dollar sign instead, right? I never figured out how to draw the pound sterling symbol. So it is about money. So many of the things that happen, right, ultimately kind of happen first in England and then trickle across the English Channel to the continent as they sort of replicate a lot of things that are going on in England. Okay, so England in the 19th century. What do I have? I have some of that on the next slide. Okay, England in the 19th century, right? They start to think more and more about childhood, right? And again, I said this before, but one of the things they notice, right, is that they have children, and the poor, in a sense, don't, right? The poor kind of don't have children in the same way as the rich do, because while their children are either in school or they have governesses or tutors that are teaching them about the way of the world, and as we get a little bit further into this period, right, and especially once adolescence gets discovered, right? And I say discovered because, somewhere around the turn of the 20th century, people really start talking about adolescence as this very particular time. They start treating their kids really differently. Among these really weird things that they do, and largely some of this is related to sex, right? Sex because of the huge preoccupation in Victorian England. They're really, really worried about it, or concerned about it. So they start subjecting, kids to very strict discipline. They start talking about puberty. They start noticing the changes that happen during puberty and labeling all of these things. And, weirdly, one of their solutions for what they should do with their sons to keep them away from sexual temptations is sending them all off to boarding schools, to live away from girls. So male-only boarding schools is like, haha, we will thwart adolescent sexuality by taking away all of the girls. Success. It was not a success. It goes spectacularly badly. And obviously you put a bunch of boys together, some boys get abused, and weirdly, having no one to have sex with, sometimes they just start having sex with each other. It's weird, right? Human beings, funny things. That, inherent sexual drive will not be quashed. Okay, so they start doing all sorts of weird things to their kids, and it's great and terrible. But they also look at the poor, right? And they're like, wow, those kids, they're just like my kids, right? They're little and they're sweet and they need to be taught things, but they're not really having a childhood, right? So what happens in the 19th century? Okay, other things that happen, I guess I'm jumping ahead of myself, and I'm sorry. One of the things that happens is they start to develop really, really, social movements start to form up concerned with the welfare of children. Some of this is driven by bad conditions, right? And again, you can see it in Charles Dickens, right? If you read Oliver Twist, or if you read A Christmas Carol, right? It's all in there, right? There are kids that are really suffering. They're working these hard jobs, often orphaned, with few prospects, even though they're children just like yours, right? Some of them get into criminal gangs. And in the 19th century, in the industrial cities of England and the United States, criminal gangs become, especially youth-led gangs, become a major part of the urban landscape, right? And this is somewhat immortalized, like in the Scorsese film, Gangs of New York. But the origins of, say, the Italian mafia, the Irish mafia, and other organized crime groups, in large part comes from people moving to the industrial cities from places like Ireland and Italy, and then forming up gangs, right? They have no prospects. There's not enough jobs for them all, and so they turn to crime, right? So what ends up happening is the kind of elites in the English-speaking countries start to worry about the prospects of these young people, right? And there's a very specific movement that forms, and it has a very funny name. It's called, the Child Saving Movement. And it starts in England, but very quickly spreads to the US, to Canada, to Australia and New Zealand, all of which have this same kind of movement, right? Okay, and so what they are really concerned about is, kind of in a very Lockean way, a lot of these children of the poor are ending up in these criminal gangs, right? They're ending up committing petty crimes. Some of the girls are turning to prostitution and using their sexual wiles to corrupt men. Even some upperclassmen are being drawn in by these streetwalkers, right? And so they're like, we need to fix the kids, right? Now, they largely sort of anchor on a couple of things, right? That the parents of these children, it's not that they're poor and that the whole economic system doesn't favor them enough. It's that ultimately they're bad parents, right? And some of this is like, these are all kind of upper or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so they're like, you know what the problem is? They're Catholic, right? Dumb Catholics. Raising their children terribly, and especially when it comes to the Irish, is like having too many children. So they start to set up a bunch of social institutions that are meant to do a couple of things, right? For one, it's to create somewhere for children to go, right? So public education, it kind of serves a dual purpose in industrialization. One, it's to give these, newly industrializing cities and industries future workers, right? And workers that are trained in literacy, math, and have the basic skills they're going to need to work, in industry, right? In factories. So they do stuff like that. The other one is they want to standardize education, and in large part to get away from things like Catholicism for immigrants, because they see this as a big problem. In Alberta, right, when Alberta is joining Canada, right, when it's splitting off from the Northwest Territory, Alberta and Saskatchewan, one of the conditions, because they're largely dominated by French settlers at the time, that they put in is we don't want just public schools, because they see public schools as Protestant. They also want Catholic schools, right? So the reason Alberta and Saskatchewan still have Catholic schools in their constitutions is because this is a fight that happens in that early part of the 20th century when they're like, no, we want to keep our Catholic identity. We don't want it to be overridden by these Protestant public schools. Okay, so they create schools, but they also create a bunch of other social institutions to try and manage this problem of a kind of youth run amok. So the most obvious ones, right, you start to see, well, a couple of things. Mid-19th century in different places, you start to see essentially institutions meant to correct youth behavior. So you get the formation of things like industrial schools and reformatory schools, so that if you get convicted of a crime and you're a kid, the judge is going to send you off and you're sentenced to go to an industrial school where you're going to learn how to work as a factory worker, right? That's largely what industrial schools are meant for. So you have industrial schools. Those spring up kind of midway through the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, and certainly into the beginning of the 20th century, you get the appearance of actual courts meant for children. And again, this comes out of the child-saving movement. In Canada, the first piece of youth criminal legislation is the Juvenile Delinquents Act, or JDA, which I think is 1911 or 1912. I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head. And the JDA sets up the first youth courts in Canada, largely copying models that they took from Chicago, right? So it starts in Toronto, and they basically copy the stuff across the lake in Chicago. But you also get the foundations of, basically social welfare system for families, and then a bunch of civil society groups that are meant to basically help young people, especially young people who are poor, transition into adulthood and teach them pro-social and positive skills. So groups like the Scouts, right? Or at the time, the Boy Scouts. 4-H clubs, Boys and Girls Club. I know I'm writing on a picture, so you can't see what I'm writing that well. Boys and Girls Clubs, right? They all have their foundations kind of at the end of the 19th or early into the 20th century. And they're all essentially aimed at the same, and there's lots more. They're all Girl Guides, right? All of them are aimed at teaching skills to young people that they will then carry with them into adulthood, right? I don't know if it's still the same. My sister was a Girl Scout, and she's a hoarder. A little bit. I helped her move. Maybe that's why I think she's a hoarder. She still has her Girl Guide uniform, which she wore when she was like 12. And I'm like, why? She's like, it's sentimental value. And the sash with all the badges on it. And I'm pretty sure there's a cupcake badge that was for baking, right? Which says, what did the Girl Guides value? Baking, right? Things that women were going to do when they were married. So a lot of these things are meant to, take kids that would have had nothing to do, put them in these clubs, for boys, teach them wilderness skills, but get them into a positive relationship with an adult and help them move into adulthood in a positive way, right? And a lot of the foundation of these things comes at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, because there's a big social push on helping young people out of poverty and out of delinquency into these more positive molds. Okay. Historically, if people start families around, when is teenage pregnancy considered negative and why? Okay, That's an interesting question. I'm going to answer the one below it because it's way easier. The JDA is the Juvenile Delinquents Act. Okay, so it's actually pretty normal until relatively recently, right? And we'll talk about this when we talk about the silence, right? And this is this generation that's largely kind of being born in the 30s and early 40s. Once we get to the 50s and 60s, right? A large number of them are getting married between 17 and 19, right? And that's considered pretty normal up until really like the 60s, and until birth control becomes available. It's really birth control that kind of shifts things, right? Where that date of marriage gets later and later. We're going to talk lots about marriage and why it gets later and later as we go. But yeah, really until probably about the 1960s, marriage at 17, well, it gets a little bit later, but 17, 18, 19 is not odd at all. And something like half of new brides in the 50s are teenagers, right? So there's a lot of teenagers getting married, and like, okay, if we're being fair, a lot of them are getting married probably because they're pregnant. There's, a lot of babies being born 7 months after weddings, because, who can wait? But yeah, what we call shotgun weddings. So it's pretty normal until relatively recently. I know it seems really odd by our standards today, but back then it wasn't odd at all. So I think it's kind of feminism, women's lib, and birth control that really shifts that whole conversation, because suddenly it's possible to have sex and not have babies at a young age, and that's when it becomes, so yeah, maybe protection is the key thing. That's when it really changes. Okay. I'm done for today. Is that my last slide? That's my last slide. All right, so we're going to start on generations on Wednesday, because today is Monday.